Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started with the special grand rounds. First, I'd like to introduce Dr. Gail Gazelle. She's a former hospice physician and part-time Harvard Medical School assistant professor and master certified coach for physicians. Dr. Gazelle is also a certified mindfulness meditation teacher. After working in the field of end-of-life care for most of her career, she shifted her focus to another vulnerable population, physicians, in the modern American healthcare system. She has coached over 500 physicians and healthcare leaders, provided that resilience skills not covered in training that may make the difference between burnout and surviving the marathon of a medical career. Dr. Gazelle is the author of 2020 Everyday Resilience, a practical guide to build inner strength and weather life's challenges. She has a variety of free guides and meditation downloads on her site. Her popular Charting Your Life workshop is available to hospitals and healthcare systems and will launch a self-paced online charting efficiency course in January of 2020. The title of our talk today is Building Everyday Well-Being, 3 Practical Steps You Can Take Today. Dr. Marsh, would you like to add anything before I turn it over to Dr. Gazelle?
Yes, please. I asked Dr. Gazelle to do this for us today after hearing about her from a colleague. I reflected back on the time I trained and for most of my career when a surgeon would never admit out loud being burned out and would certainly never ask for help dealing with, or at least not admit to, dealing with stress. I clearly remember being asked to do a liver transplant the day my oldest child came home from the hospital. I dropped him and his mother off at our apartment and went straight to the hospital, where I spent the rest of the day in the OR. I also remember working every day. My second child was on ECMO, and the same from the time my third child was on the ventilator shortly after birth. Part of working during those days served as a distraction. Most of it was simply the insanity that is expected of physicians and especially surgeons. It was insane then, 30 plus years ago, and it's insane now. This is likely the same for all of us. This has really come into focus in the last 2 years during this pandemic. Hopefully, we will all learn a great deal from this lecture and realize that when we are overly stressed, we are of no benefit to our patients, our families, and our colleagues. Thank you, Dr. Gazelle, for doing this for us.
Well, thank you both, Dr. Borgstrom and Dr. Marsh, for those opening words. And thank you to everybody for making the time to be here. I'm going to jump right in. You know, when we think about burnout, I probably don't have to tell you what burnout looks like. When we're burnt out, we're really not at our best, as Dr. Marsh really illustrated. And we're suffering from a level of emotional exhaustion where even if we're lucky enough to get a good night's sleep, it doesn't really matter because we're dragging ourselves from one thing to the next, one case to the next. In addition to emotional exhaustion, we're cynical. We're wondering, why did we go into the practice of medicine in the first place? Why bother? What difference am I making? And we depersonalize. We don't see our patients and coworkers as the full human beings that they are, but we begin to see them as almost like an obstacle course that we have to navigate through to get through the end of each day. And then the third part of the triad of physician burnout is that we become detached, not just from our sense of meaning and purpose, but really from our ability to recognize our strengths and accomplishments. And so what I want to do over the next hour is dig a little bit deeper into the etiologic factors that push physician and surgeon burnout, more importantly, that can push you into the side of resilience. I hope by the end of the session, you'll understand why it's really important to focus on your strengths. And we'll also touch on the importance of mindfulness, which is one intervention that multiple studies have demonstrated can mitigate physician burnout. This is a dynamic session. We'll be doing some poll questions. We'll be following a case that I'm going to present. And you'll also get a little bit of experience with some personal resilience strategies. So I hope you're ready to engage with some poll questions and also get a little bit of practice. And when we think about burnout, you know, I think it's obvious to physicians that there was an epidemic going on before the COVID pandemic. And this is an article from Health Affairs in 2017 that really talks about how the phenomenon of burnout was considered at that time an early warning sign, kind of the canary in the coal mine of deep, deep dysfunction in healthcare. And as probably most of you know, burnout levels are not exactly low in the surgeons. This is a piece from JAMA Surgery in 2018. This is a viewpoint piece that accompanied a research article as well. And the numbers for burnout amongst physicians can be seen to be as high in one in two surgeons. So this article quotes a figure of 53%. Now, keep in mind, this was before COVID, that the problem of burnout has been there and it's not exactly low in surgeons. And this was an interesting piece that came out very recently, just about 6 months ago, as you can see, and it was based on a survey done by the American College of Surgeons to really look at, well, what was the impact of COVID on the life of particularly the young surgeons. So this was a survey that went out to 20,000 members of a variety of American College of Surgeons subgroups that targeted residents, fellows, and attendings who were in practice less than 6 years. And not surprisingly, look at this, 96% said that their clinical experience really was poor as a result of COVID. As all of you can probably relate to, people couldn't accrue the kind of cases that they expected to accrue in the early part of their career, and in fact were needed. Didactic resident education went down. Obviously, resources and time were put in other endeavors, but not surprisingly, there were, unusual and what were considered at that time innovative education and training solutions. And they didn't really quantify in this study that approximately 1,100 physicians responded to, but they noted that as a result of the pandemic, there were increases in depression, anxiety, burnout, emotional exhaustion. This survey was sent out early in the pandemic, July of 2020, so that they noted that some of the predictive factors for depression, anxiety, burnout, and emotional exhaustion were known exposure, inadequate PPE, and then higher levels for female surgeons than male. And in addition to the pandemic, we're seeing something in healthcare that I think is really important to recognize when we think about factors that are causing burnout and perhaps impairing the natural resilience that surgeons have. And that's called VUCA. This is a term that comes to us from the military, but is increasingly being applied to healthcare. So VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and chaos and ambiguity. So we can see these things operating through the lens of COVID, the tremendous volatility that I'm sure each of you are experiencing in your practice, the uncertainty, what's going to happen next. We're now learning more, obviously, about the Omicron variant. What's going to happen with that variant? We physicians know that there will be further mutations. What's going to happen with the next variant that pops up? So all the complexity and often chaotic environments that this is leaving us to, and a great deal of ambiguity. And when we zoom out and really look at the whole healthcare system in the US, we see some really complicated phenomena that are occurring. For example, it's estimated by the AMA that in 2020 alone, almost 50,000 physicians left independent practice for employment. Between 2019 and 2020, hospitals and corporate entities acquired approximately 20,000 physician practices. For the first time since the AMA has been measuring this, since I believe it's about 2012, less than 50% of physicians remain in private practice. And an interesting perspective is that 4% of physician practices, which includes hospital-based employment, are actually owned by private equity firms. It's estimated by Rick Pollock, who is the president of the American Hospital Association, that in 2021 alone, largely due to the burden of the pandemic, hospitals will lose somewhere between $54 and $90 billion. And an interesting phenomenon to juxtapose with this is, I don't know if any of you know who the second richest woman is on the planet. You can take your guesses, but it's Judy Faulkner, who is the founder and CEO of Epic Healthcare Systems. So this is really what we can think about with VUCA. What's the kind of the swirl of what's going on in healthcare that's making it even more difficult for physicians to stay grounded and steady and focused and thriving in their practices. And this can leave physicians really with something called learned helplessness. You may remember this term from college psychology courses where rats or dogs were put through a series of exercises where they basically learned that there was nothing they could do to stop, let's say, a painful shock. And once they learned that through these experimental protocols, they basically stopped trying. So that's what learned helplessness is. And we can begin to see this in the American physician population, that we can almost become like this horse that's sitting there on a sunny day, thinking that it can't actually move, but of course could move beyond that rickety chair. And then we also see something like this, and we have to add in a little bit of humor because this is otherwise a very heavy topic. All of these phenomena can leave physicians feeling like, well, they might as well just roll over dead. Now what's going to be on our tombstones is not all the wonderful things that we did, but what our lifetime RVU is. And this can also leave us suffering from something that has been named moral injury, another term that comes to us from the military, but it's a term that I think physicians are increasingly aware of. Moral injury. Obviously, in times of war, we send young people off to do fairly morally repugnant things, right? That's part of what they're doing as young soldiers. And of course, they're doing that in the name of nation and democracy, but the name for that is moral injury. And that term is increasingly applied to what physicians are expected to do in the modern healthcare system. Are you expected to take care of your patients? Are you expected to be kind of the person who gets all the insurance offs? Are you at the beck and call of your hospital? So this is why we're thinking about moral injury. And in fact, you may be familiar with Z-Dog MD, a hospitalist who's also a very talented musician, performer, and rapper, who coined this term as well and has a couple of videos on this. And in those videos, Z-Dog MD kind of draws this distinction between the system and the individual. So much is broken in the healthcare system. In 2017, we were beginning to talk about dysfunction in healthcare. I think now, by the end of 2021, it's fairly obvious through the lens of the pandemic in particular, that there's a lot that isn't working in the American healthcare system. That's no longer in question. And so as we begin to drill down on physician burnout and resilience, it's easy to think, well, it's all the responsibility of the system. The system has to be fixed. The hospitals have to address all of the problems with the EMR and with staffing and with so many of the things that are precipitating high levels of burnout. The system has to be fixed. Don't ask me to do anything because it's up to the system. And so what we're talking about today is not so much how you might come to a lecture like this. You might think to yourself, well, why would I go hear a lecture about resilience? She's just going to tell us, keep a gratitude journal, do yoga, meditate, and life will be bliss. That's not what I'm here to talk about today. I'm here to talk about what the choices are that each of you have and what are the tools that you need, not just to be resilient, because I'm imagining that many of you have tremendous resilience, but to apply that resilience to the difficulties that you face on a day in, day out basis. Of course, the systems need to be fixed, and any efforts that any of you make in that direction, I personally would applaud, and I think everybody on this Grand Rounds would also applaud. But is it likely that the system is going to be fixed anytime soon? Are we going to get a better EMR, for example? Are we somehow going to have the kind of staffing that we need, both on the physician, nursing, tech side? Are all the problems in healthcare going away? Obviously not. In fact, it's fair to say that they may even become more complicated over time. So what we're talking about today is what each and every one of you can do, not by going off and meditating for hours a day that you don't have, but I hope that I'll be able to share some things that you can add into your day to help you manage and be the best that you can despite the difficulties. Because after all, what are the options? What are the options for each of you who has spent so many years in rigorous training, working incredibly hard to get where you are in your career? So one of the options, as I've said, is to work towards systems reform, a fantastic option. Many of you are probably involved in efforts locally and perhaps even nationally. Some of the other options, well, you can leave clinical practice. We're seeing physicians leave clinical care, going into insurance jobs, pharma jobs, non-medical jobs. Of course, it's an option to retire early, although you may have kids and families that you have to support. Sadly, some physicians are developing maladaptive behaviors, throwing things in the OR, being reported to their state physician health service, and I certainly don't want that for any of you. Very tragically, some physicians are turning to self-harm. But what we're going to look at today is how to both build your resilience and how to apply your resilience so that you can manage all of the VUCA elements that you are facing. So let me introduce a case here, and I've changed, this is a surgeon that I coached, but I've changed some of the details to protect anonymity. Let's call this surgeon Bill, who's in practice somewhere across the US. He's a 42-year-old general surgeon, very well respected by his colleagues, top of his game, no question about clinical acumen. His wife is an internist, and they actually care for her elderly mother who has worsening Alzheimer's. Bill was doing pretty well in his career. He was managing all of the various demands, but since the birth of their third child 3 years ago, he's really found it more difficult to manage everything, in particular with the addition of an elder with Alzheimer's. He really enjoys his group, but unfortunately they're perennially understaffed and they haven't been successful at recruitment. Hospital volumes are high, but with the nursing shortage, Bill can't get the OR time he formerly so easily got and really took for granted. COVID numbers are up in his part of the country, and he and his colleagues are struggling to manage the overwhelming number of cases. Bill told me that he often finds his mind racing when he's at work. He's worrying about family duties in addition to concerns about his patients. When he's at home, he finds himself ruminating about difficult cases, really unable to turn off his mind when he's home, and feels a sense of guilt that he can't actually be present for his wife and kids. He has a sense that he's failing, both at home and in his clinical life. He's frustrated, deeply frustrated by all the changes in his hospital, all the inefficiencies, all the calls from the ED, the sense of almost being dumped on by non-surgical colleagues. He finds his calls stressful, and when he gets calls from the ED, he feels a growing, gnawing sense in his gut and is actually fearful that maybe he has something bad going on. He told me he was really exhausted, wasn't sure how he could go on in his practice, and yet he held out hope that things could be different, and that's why he came to me for coaching. Now, one of the first questions that I asked Bill that I want to ask each of you is, did your training give you what you need to manage all the stresses of this time? Now, David, I'm not sure if we have this one as a poll or we want people to put their responses in the chat.
They can put it in the chat. Unfortunately, I do not have this poll.
No problem. So if people would just take a moment to put in the chat the answer, did your training give you what you need to manage the stresses of this time? What's your best guess? Yes or no? So please take a moment and just see if I can open the chat. Okay, so 3 people have answered so far, and they say no, no, no. The 4th person says no. Any of you others want to throw something in there? Okay, I think that's the 5th, no. And I give these talks across the nation to various groups of physicians, and occasionally there's a yes thrown in there. I think in one institution, there was a yes in maybe about 4 out of 100 people. But typically, what physicians and surgeons say is that no, you learn so many things in your training. I mean, it's amazing how much we learn. And yet nothing really about how to manage this VUCA environment, how to be flexible, how to interact with all of this change, how to manage change, which is in fact is a course taught in business schools. And yet in physician training, this is very typical that we learn next to nothing about how to manage these stresses. And in fact, Bill didn't even miss a beat. He said, absolutely not. And what Bill said he learned instead was to strive for a standard of perfection, to be very critical of himself, to tell himself things like he wasn't worthy, he wasn't as good as other people, can't make a mistake, what if I'll be found out as a fraud? Nobody sees how good I am. He told me he was taught to experience a sense of shame when he didn't have the answer. And in fact, he could recollect, even at the age of 42, not as old as Dr. Marsh and myself, and yet even a younger generation of surgeons could recall multiple times when he had been shamed, in fact, and as he put it, thrown under the bus at times for not meeting the unattainable standard of perfection. Bill told me he was taught to hide his struggles, to never show weakness, to always be the captain of the team, invulnerable, the one who is always in command. And that meant never asking for help, deferring his own self-care, really believing that he was invincible, he was supposed to be invincible, and so even denying his own physiologic needs, and certainly never calling in sick. So I think this is just important to understand as a backdrop to some of the etiologic factors that contribute to burnout. Of course, all of the maladies in our system are without question massive. They're profound and they're weighing, and I think really weighing on every physician and maybe beyond physicians. And yet, at the same time, what I think about as a backstory, kind of the psychology of what's going on for each and every one of you, it's important to understand what you didn't learn in your training, what you did learn, and similarly, what was role modeled for you. And so next I asked Bill, and I want to just run this question by you as well. Well, what parts of all of this are under your control? Bill was really struggling. He was spending a lot of time ruminating about all the problems in healthcare. Why are we so understaffed? My hospital really screwed up. They should have been more strategic in getting nurses on board. Why didn't they invest in recruiting another surgeon for my practice? He spent a lot of his emotional energy railing against problems in the system, really angry and expending a lot of emotional energy. And yet when I asked him this question, what parts of this are under your control? He could really begin to see what you see in this graphic, that what was under his control was actually tiny. What you see is the red dot in this graphic. There were things that he could influence beyond what was on his control, but the much bigger sphere of what's going on in healthcare was actually outside of Bill's control. And he told me that once he began thinking about things through this lens, he was actually able to relax at least a little bit. He was able to really see that all of the energy that he was expending in anger and frustration and resentment, and almost taking things personally in the healthcare difficulties, he was able to relax a little bit and realize that that really wasn't helping his cause. And in fact, was leaving him being up sometimes at 2 a.m. in the morning, ruminating and kind of having this internal argument about things that were going wrong. And it helped him actually quiet that tendency. Now, this is my dog, Miss Sydney. She is not suffering from burnout. And for those of you who have canine, feline, maybe avian pets, you know that they can just lie around blissfully, getting a good meal, somebody rubbing their tummy or underneath their neck, and life is pretty darn good. But for us, it's not quite that simple, right? That's the curse and the blessing of our tremendous cognitive function. And unlike the dogs and cats, we can find ourselves paying more attention to what's not going well rather than what is. And similarly, we can find ourselves focusing more on our weaknesses than our strengths. And we're going to run another a poll question here. David, if you can run this. Do you tend to focus more on what you've accomplished or what you haven't? In other words, are you somebody who finishes your day and kind of almost runs the Rolodex, the mental Rolodex? I didn't get this done. I didn't get that done. Why didn't I do better at this? So can you launch that poll, David? Thank you. So please take a moment to respond. Do you focus more on what you've accomplished or what you haven't? Just give it your best guess. And David, I'll let you run the results when you have them. Okay, so 17% of you focus more on what you've accomplished. 83% of you identify that you haven't. And so, in other words, you're somebody who tends to perhaps ruminate. I didn't get this done. I didn't get that done. You can close that poll. And that, I think, in many ways speaks to the negativity bias that operates in the human brain. We're all familiar with this term, the negativity bias, that on an evolutionary basis, we didn't exactly survive and climb up the evolutionary ladder because of our physical prowess. No, we climbed because we developed a brain that could let us know about threats in the environment, the amygdala, the limbic system that we're all familiar with that can take us into fight, flight, freeze, kept us safe from saber-toothed tigers and woolly mammoths and warring tribes and all of the things that prehistoric man and woman faced. And yet that same negativity bias now operates for psychological threats to our sense of being a good physician, of being as smart as our peers, for example. What you see, just adding a little humor here, is the heart is looking at all these good things, good, brain, come see. And the brain says, not now, can't you see I'm busy? And the brain is hyper-focused on that one thing that went wrong. And perhaps you can relate to this. Bill certainly could, that he might have a whole, plethora of cases that went really well, but that one case where he ran into some difficulty, maybe not even a major complication, and that was the one that he would ruminate on for days and even weeks. And it was really, really dragging him down. And so I want to pivot here and really begin to explore a little more deeply, what do we know? What is the science? What are the studies about what the heck we can do about this, given that most of you, as you said, did not learn how to apply your resilience. You didn't learn that in your training. So it's almost like we're doing some remediation here. And this is just one of the meta-analyses and systematic reviews that have appeared as the interest and research dollars in burnout have grown. So this came out in 2016. It identified, through really thousands of studies, really only identified 15 randomized controlled studies that help us to understand that there are a variety of approaches that we need to help physicians learn how to be resilient to all of the changes and volatility and uncertainty and ambiguity that healthcare is bringing our way. And they really classified the interventions into three categories. So on the kind of the meta side, the non-personal resilience side, they really talked about the culture of wellness. What can be done to promote civility and wellness? What kind of interventions are there? For example, what is your call schedule like? Can anything be done there? Can anything be done about how various parts of the hospital system are coexisting and working together as a team, or really kind of siloed in their own fiefdoms? So that's kind of on the systems level. They also talked about some of the kind of practical interventions, like how to have an EMR that's more effective. That's kind of the second strategy, is efficiency of practice. But the third piece is personal resilience. And they really stressed that all three of these are critically important. And similarly, they identified a number of studies in the area of mindfulness. So we have a lot of data telling us about high levels of burnout in many, many medical and surgical specialties. We have very few studies at this point in time about how to address it. And these meta-analyses have identified a number of studies using mindfulness. And so this is just an example of one. This was a study that came out in 2009, one of the earliest randomized control studies looking at a mindfulness intervention in 74 primary care physicians. And they did an 8-week intervention where they taught mindfulness meditation and some other mindfulness skills. And then they followed these physicians for a 10-month period afterwards. And they actually found statistically significant decreases in emotional exhaustion and an increase in that sense of capacity, accomplishment, and awareness of strengths. This hasn't been investigated fully in surgeons. This is a tiny study, 21 physicians. It's almost amazing that they were able to publish this. This came out in 2019. And again, I don't think the story is all in on a research level, but we're beginning to understand how mindfulness can be helpful to physicians and surgeons. So let's kind of drill down. What is this thing, mindfulness, that we're finding can be helpful? And mindfulness is this quality of mind where we're really aware of what's going on right here, right now, in the present moment. And we're developing that awareness. This definition says non-judgmentally, but we're developing an awareness with less judgment than the human mind typically brings to the many moments of our days. So mindfulness, in other words, the mind can flit to the past, to the future. What Bill told me about is he would be with his family. His mind would not necessarily be present, even though his body was. His mind would be reviewing the cases that he'd had that past week, thinking about patients that he had recovering that in that time in the ICU or on the floors. His mind would be going to what the next week was going to be like, what kind of overbooked schedule he would have, whether he would get OR time, what would happen in those cases, would he do okay with his surgical skills, flitting back and forth. But he had a difficult time being mindful, keeping his mind focused on where he was in those moments with his family. And when we pay attention with mindfulness, we can actually lead our mind back from all of these worries and fears and theories and attitudes and abstractions, and can take us a little more into the present, the actual experience, moment to moment. The fact that each of you are now on this grand rounds, either in person or on Zoom, and yet your mind could be replaying something that's going on, or an argument that you had, or somebody who cut you off on the highway. That's the experience of the human mind. And with mindfulness, we can train the mind to be a bit more focused, and it can help us do what you see here, free ourselves in a way from a straitjacket of unconscious living. Now, the human mind is an incredibly busy place. I probably don't have to tell you that. It's estimated that we produce 20,000 to 50,000 thoughts on an average day. If you do the math on that, it's really a crazy number of thoughts per waking hour. And it wouldn't surprise me if physicians have closer to 75,000 thoughts a day. Our minds are just amazingly busy places. But I want you to see for yourself whether your mind is busy or not. So I'm going to take a pause here. And when I tell you, I'm going to time 2 minutes, 120 seconds. And what I'd like each of you to do is count how many thoughts you have in that 2-minute period. So you can almost imagine that you're kind of going to be like a cat at a mouse hole, ready to pounce whenever a thought comes into your mind. So mentally count the number of thoughts in this 2-minute period, or you can actually jot down a tally. So we'll start that 2 minutes now. That's 30 seconds. That's 60 seconds. That's 90 seconds. And that's 2 minutes. So we're going to run a poll here. If you could answer how many thoughts you had. David, when you have a moment to run that. Thank you. So did you have 1 thought, 2 to 5, 6 to 10, or perhaps too many to count? Okay, so 13% had 2 to 5 thoughts. Nobody had 1. 29% of you 6 to 10, and 58% too many to count.
Keep thinking.
So just begins to give you a flavor of what's going on in your own mind. And so many times this is going on really in the shadow of our awareness. In fact, our mind is just kind of producing all of these thoughts, many of which are, of course, incredibly useful. Get out of bed, get dressed, go to the OR. This is Lyme disease, making a diagnosis, an incredible gift that the human mind has to have this kind of cognitive function. And yet what we're getting at here is that sometimes our thoughts can actually be problematic. And this is an anonymous quote, but I think it's relevant. What is thought? Thought is your friend. Thought is your enemy. No one can harm you as much as unwise thought, and no one can help you more than wise thoughts. So in other words, many of our thoughts, incredibly helpful. We want them, we rely on them. They're where our expertise lies. But at the same time, the mind is often producing thoughts that are actually not helpful. And that's what Bill began to understand more about his own mind. He got to know this instrument that he and all of us are operating 24/7, that we learn very little about how to operate, how to work with our human mind, how to manage the flow of thoughts that we have. So we've touched on what mindfulness is, this awareness of what's happening, this awareness of when the mind is going to unhelpful thoughts. The converse of that is mindlessness, when we're almost on a kind of autopilot. We all have that experience in the car. We get in the car at point A. The next thing we know, we're at point B. Maybe we've been on a conversation. Maybe we're listening to the radio, whatever it is. And we're wondering, how on earth did I get here? That's an example of mindlessness. You get to the end of your day. What did I eat today? Did I eat lunch? You don't even know. It's a blur for your busy days. So we can really be on autopilot, where the mind is just involuntarily flitting around here, there, and everywhere with this lack of awareness and lack of focus on what it is that's going on right in front of us. Sadly, this can leave us really stuck, rigid, and very judgmental about ourselves, about the people in our environment, about our circumstances, and like Bill, can take us to a place of reactivity rather than a place of poised, expert, professional response, and furthermore, can contribute to the stress and anxiety and burnout that many surgeons are experiencing. And as I touched on with Bill, when we're mindless, it's really the ultimate mind-body dissociation. The body is always present here in the future. We can rely on that. And yet the mind is often not present right here in the present. Now, there's a very rich level of studies and growing research about the impact of meditation, which is the tool by which we become more mindful. Tremendous benefits. Many of you, I'm sure, are aware of benefits in healthcare, benefits for lowering blood pressure. Post-MI rehab programs often have meditation components. There may be elements in surgical care where there are mindfulness or meditation programs for patients. A lot of evidence in the mental health field about decreases in depression and anxiety, increases in well-being. And very importantly, the impact on the central nervous system. So we touched on the negativity bias, the fight, flight, freeze that is part of the human experience. Interestingly, even short periods of meditation can shrink the size of the amygdala, can increase gray matter in multiple brain regions associated with attention, concentration, as you can see here, sensory processing, memory. increased activity in the prefrontal cortex, and increases in telomere length. And really, this is a short list of the positive impact that meditation and mindfulness can have. So rather than making this an esoteric concept, in addition to counting your thoughts and beginning to heighten your awareness of the busyness of your mind, I want to walk you through something called the STOP protocol. It's a protocol for taking purposeful pauses. So I want to invite each of you to just bring to mind any difficulty that you're having, difficulty with a clinical case, interacting with a coworker or a colleague, a personal interaction outside of work, something that's been on your mind. And don't pick a 10 out of 10 difficulty, but pick any difficulty that comes to mind, anything you've been struggling with that you're finding your mind kind of gravitating to. And bring to mind in particular some difficult moment when you get activated. Perhaps your emotional temperature rises and that sense of reactivity, that what's going on isn't right or isn't fair or should be different. So bring that to mind and take a moment to almost take your own emotional temperature. In other words, on a 0 to 10 scale, where 0 is low and 10 is, through the roof, just rate your emotional temperature. Give it your best guess. And then in the protocol, we start with the S, simply stop. Simply physically or mentally stop. So kind of freeze the frame as you're reliving this difficult moment. And simply take 3 slow, deep breaths. Imagine now that you stepped out of yourself and you're watching yourself from the vantage point of a neutral third-party observer, an observer that knows you well, that knows your difficulties, your struggles, knows your life trajectory. But furthermore, this observer cares about you. They care about your well-being. They want you to thrive and feel a sense of fulfillment and meaning in your life and your work. So they're a kindly observer. And you can imagine somebody perhaps who's been kindly towards you and how your circumstance, your difficult circumstance might look to that observer. Imagine what they might say to you as you're experiencing this challenge, this stress, this difficulty. And now that you've done this, see if you can praise yourself around this difficulty in any way, small or large. It might take the form of, you're trying your best. It might take the form of, I see you, and I know how hard you're working. Just take a moment to give yourself that praise. And then, now that you've done this exercise and taken this purposeful pause, see if you can have any more ideas, if your field has been expanded about how to deal with this difficulty. Is there anything new, perhaps, that popped into your mind that could expand your repertoire of how to deal with this type of difficulty? And then, after doing this exercise, proceeding. So this is the STOP protocol. S, putting the pause, the stop button. T, slowing down and taking those 3 slow, deep breaths. In other words, engaging the parasympathetic nervous system to help put the brakes on the sympathetic activation that you may be experiencing. The O is to take that stance of the neutral, yet caring and kind observer. And then the P, really taking that time to praise yourself, to identify one thing that you're doing well regarding this difficulty, small or large. And then going on to plan and proceed. It's not a cure-all, but it's something that we can add into our days that doesn't take a lot of time. can do it before going into a next case. If you have administrative meetings, if you're feeling kind of agitated about them, or an argument or difficulty with your teenager at home, whatever it is, this is something that you can try out to build just a little bit of space and a tool to moderate your own emotional temperature. Excuse me. And another tool that I want to just mention is to question what you're taking personally. You may remember the Beatles song from 1970 from Let It Be, I, Me, Mine. Well, in addition to really being a thought kind of factory, the mind is very self-referential. When we pause, when we pay attention to what our mind is up to, we see the plethora of thoughts, but we can also begin to identify that many of our thoughts are about us, what we like, what we don't like, what's going well for us, what's going well for our kids, what's not going well in our hospital system, right? A lot of these thoughts are I, me, and mine. And additionally, a lot of our thoughts are judgments. I don't like this. Why isn't this different? Why did this happen? How could this be going on in my hospital? These non-clinical administrators, why are they kind of telling me how to run my practice? So we become more aware with mindfulness of what the mind is up to. And what Bill told me is that he often found himself taking things very personally. In other words, a lot of the problems in his hospital, a lot of the facts that non-clinicians in the form of administrators at various levels are now controlling much in his practice and perhaps in yours. Bill felt that he wasn't being respected, that his hard work wasn't being seen, that it wasn't seen just how incredibly devoted he was to each and every one of his patients. And yet, when we looked at what he could control and what he was taking personally, he was able to see that a lot of this just had to do with dysfunction in healthcare. It really had very little to do with him. And that helped him modulate his emotional temperature and what he was taking personally. So these are 3 techniques, just to highlight them, that I've touched on. The first, paying attention to what you've accomplished as opposed to what you haven't. So again, if you're somebody that at the end of your day, when you're trying to relax and unwind, your mind, unfortunately, is running your cases and going over what's going on, what you feel you could have done better, what you're worried about the next day. One way that you can practice and build resilience to the difficulties is flip that and actually challenge yourself to name 3 things that you did accomplish that day, that you did do well, that evidence your strengths as a surgeon in your practice. That's the first resilience strategy that I really want to encourage you to employ. You don't have to go on vacation to do that. You don't have to sit on the mountaintop and meditate. You can just work with yourself to reframe the events of your day. Of course, you want to learn from the difficulties. That's not a question. I think what we can become aware of is how much our mind does that in overdrive. We think that if we keep replaying all of those difficulties, somehow we're going to solve them. And yet, what I think many surgeons and physicians identify is that that actually isn't the case. So that's the first strategy that I want to leave you with. The second that we talked about is the stop protocol. Noticing when your emotional temperature is up. It happens to all human beings. We get triggered. We enter that sympathetic state that I think we can all experience, where the heart is racing, our breath is more shallow, our face is flushed, and we're almost like this. We're bracing for a fight. And so getting to know that, taking your emotional temperature, and then utilizing the stop protocol to stop and pause, observe from a different vantage point, take the 3 slow, deep breaths, and from there, praise yourself in any way, small or large, plan and proceed. And then the third strategy that I'd like you to consider employing is just noticing what you're taking personally and ask yourself, is this really about me? Because so much of our emotional activation can be this sense that something is personal, the lens that the Beatles help us understand of I, me, and mine. So those are 3 strategies that I want to encourage you to incorporate into your day. I'm happy to be a resource for you. Dr. Marsh asked me if I could kind of be a resource to the department, and I'm happy to do that. My email is here, info@gailgazelle.com. Please don't hesitate to reach out. I offer 30-minute complimentary coaching sessions. So if you're wondering about what this coaching thing is, if you're thinking maybe this can help me build my resilience, become a better leader, work on my communication and conflict management, my ability to interact in a good way with my team, I'm happy to get on a 30-minute free coaching call with you. And you can book that through my email or through my site. I also run a popular private Facebook group. If any of you are on Facebook, it's called Mindful MD. So please feel free to reach out for that as well. And because there's a lot of interest in mindfulness, I've developed a short free course that goes over 14 days, where you get an audio each day, and in less than 10 minutes, I talk about a mindfulness topic in a very practical and pragmatic way, and then give you some practice meditating. So thank you so much for your attention. We covered a lot of ground here. We really talked about all the factors that can contribute to burnout, the VUCA factors, as well as kind of the psychological backstory that I referenced. Then we talked about some of the studies and what we're beginning to understand about how to impact this and how to help each of you get these skills that you're identifying you did not get in your training. And then the practical strategies as well. So we have a little bit of time for questions. David, if you want to field any questions in the chat, or if anybody wants to unmute and ask a question, happy to do my best to address them.
Sure. Do we have any questions for Dr. Gazelle or comments? I'll tell you, one of the things that struck me that you talked about was the negativity bias. As surgeons, at least I will for myself, I spent a lot of time beating myself up over things that didn't turn out, cases that didn't go as well as I would have hoped to. And we just tended to think in that perspective, and, don't sit back and reflect very often on the things that turned out very well. We do, but it seems to me we do it fairly briefly, and then turn on to things we could have done better.
Yeah. And then again, of course, you want to be learning from cases that don't go as well. I mean, that's a given. That's not a question. So it's not an either or, it's a both and. How can I extract the learning? I always want to be improving. I'm sure that's the case for each and every one of you. And yet, when does my mind take me into overdrive, as you're identifying, David, and as I'm sure other participants can relate to? When are we on the side of really profoundly diminishing returns, keeping me up at night so that I can't be at my best the next day, keeping me from being present with my family members? That's what we're talking about here, is that kind of nuance. Yeah. Any other thoughts or questions?
Residents or students have any questions you'd like me to share? Dr. Marsh?
Yeah, I appreciate this. It was very helpful for me. When you keep talking about meditating, my thought was, okay, now I have to look up how to meditate. I wouldn't even know how to start meditating.
Yeah. Well, that's a great question, Dr. Marsh. It's really quite simple. It's really just sitting and trying to pay attention to the act of breathing. Sounds easy, doesn't it? Just sit, let's say, for 3 minutes and just focus on your breathing. And yet, I want to challenge each of you to do that, perhaps with that brief and free meditation course that I have. And you'll see all of a sudden it's not so easy. It's not that easy to focus your mind on your breathing. Some thought comes up, oh, what do I have to do next? Or an argument. It's just incredible, the thoughts that come up, planning a vacation that's 6 months from now. What's going to happen with COVID? And that's what's very important about meditation. We get to know what the mind is up to. In other words, we have to diagnose our own mind before we can actually treat. It's very much like what we're doing in clinical medicine. We have to get to know all the kind of, the things that the mind is doing, because it's only then that we can kind of harness the ability that we have to work with this incredible instrument, this God-given instrument that all human beings have. So, Dr. Marsh, maybe I can challenge you as you lead the department, maybe you can also take a look at that meditation resource and help some of your surgeons do this. It's fascinating, and it can, at a minimum, builds calm and helps to build the ability to focus. And who doesn't want more calm and focus?
He could become our meditation teacher.
I see this in your future, Dr. Marsh. You're going to be the guru for the department. Yes. And maybe you too, Dr. Borgstrom.
Anyone else? Well, Dr. Gazelle, thank you very much for this. It was very enlightening, and I believe will be very helpful to our faculty, residents, and hopefully our students. Certainly, these are things that are fairly straightforward, and we appreciate your support for this. I will share the contact info with Dr. Gazelle via email, as well as her website for anyone that's interested. Any last words, Dr. Marsh, before we sign off?
No, thank you so much, Dr. Gazelle.
Well,
Thank you, Dr. Gazelle.
for your time today. And I really wish you much resilience as you go forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you very